Some of the most life-changing discoveries aren't hidden inside locked safes or forgotten attics. They fit inside something as ordinary as a worn leather wallet. We spend our lives believing that the contents of a wallet tell a simple story: a driver's license, a few credit cards, perhaps a family photograph reminding someone why they work so hard every day. But every now and then, one small object carries a memory that refuses to stay in the past. A memory powerful enough to follow a complete stranger home. Imagine finding a wallet in an almost empty parking lot after another ordinary day. You do what most decent people hope they would do. You pick it up, search for identification, and prepare to return it, without expecting anything in return. Then, just before you close it, an old photograph slips from a hidden compartment. A young girl. A weathered wooden cabin. 6 handwritten words that make no sense at all. Don't forget what happened here. You hand the wallet back that same afternoon, believing your role in the story is over. But days later, you see that very same cabin on the evening news, and suddenly, one harmless photograph becomes impossible to forget. Today's story is inspired by real accounts of honest strangers returning lost wallets and real stories of communities remembering extraordinary acts of courage during times of disaster. Names, locations, and identifying details have been changed to protect privacy, while preserving the heart of the story. Before we go any deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because sometimes the thing you return isn't what stays with you, it's the one thing you were never supposed to see. David Miller wasn't looking for trouble that afternoon. At 56 years old, the former firefighter had settled into a life defined by routine rather than excitement. Since losing his wife several years earlier, quiet days had become something he appreciated instead of feared. He spent his mornings helping neighbors with small repairs, his afternoons working part-time at a local hardware store, and his weekends fishing at the same lake where he and his wife once escaped, whenever life became overwhelming. There was comfort in familiar places and familiar habits. After finishing his shift, David crossed an almost empty parking lot toward his aging pickup truck when something caught the corner of his eye. Resting near the curb was a weathered brown leather wallet, worn enough to suggest it had traveled through many years of everyday life. He picked it up, expecting to find only identification that would help him locate its owner. Inside were several credit cards, a driver's license belonging to a man named Thomas Reed, and enough cash to make many people pause before deciding what to do next. David didn't hesitate. Years earlier, after his late wife accidentally lost her engagement ring at a grocery store, an honest stranger had gone to extraordinary lengths to return it. That act of integrity had stayed with him ever since. He often said that kindness only survives if someone chooses to continue it. Returning Thomas Reed's wallet felt like another opportunity to honor the same principle. As he carefully closed the wallet, however, one loose photograph slipped silently onto the pavement. David bent down and picked it up, expecting to see a smiling family portrait, or perhaps an old vacation memory. Instead, he found himself staring at a faded photograph that looked decades old. A young girl stood beside a modest wooden cabin surrounded by trees. There was nothing remarkable about the image itself until he noticed the handwritten message along the bottom edge. The ink had faded with time, but the words remained perfectly readable. Don't forget what happened here. David studied the photograph for several moments. There was no date, no names, no indication of where the cabin might be. Something about the expression on the little girl's face stayed with him. She wasn't smiling for the camera. She simply looked toward the photographer with a seriousness that seemed strangely unusual for someone so young. David carefully returned the photograph to the hidden compartment where he had found it, and contacted Thomas Reed using the information on the driver's license. They agreed to meet later that afternoon. The exchange lasted only a few minutes. Thomas thanked David politely, quickly counted nothing inside the wallet except one thing. His fingers immediately searched the hidden pocket until they found the faded photograph still tucked safely inside. Only then did the tension leave his face. Before getting back into his car, Thomas looked directly at David and quietly asked, "Did you happen to look at the picture?" David answered honestly that he had. Thomas forced a faint smile that never quite reached his eyes, before replying, "Some memories are better left alone." Then he drove away. Most people would have forgotten the conversation before reaching home. David couldn't. 3 days later, when the evening news showed a weathered wooden cabin scheduled for demolition after standing abandoned for decades, his heart skipped a beat. It was the same cabin from the photograph. In that instant, he realized finding Thomas Reed's wallet might never have been as ordinary as it first appeared. Most people who knew David Miller would have described him using the same handful of words: honest, dependable, quiet. At 56 years old, he had already lived through experiences that shaped the kind of man he became, long before he found Thomas Reed's wallet. During more than 2 decades as a firefighter, David responded to emergencies that most people only saw on the evening news. He learned that ordinary lives could change forever in a matter of minutes, and he carried those lessons into every part of his life after retirement. Neighbors trusted him with spare house keys while they traveled. Friends called him whenever they needed advice or simply someone willing to listen without judgment. Since losing his wife several years earlier, his world had grown much smaller, but not because he had become bitter. If anything, grief had made him more compassionate. Living alone on a quiet property just outside a small rural town gave him the peace he needed, and helping others gave him purpose. Returning a lost wallet wasn't an extraordinary act in David's mind. It was simply the right thing to do. Yet despite returning it only hours after finding it, he couldn't shake the feeling that the faded photograph inside had somehow followed him home. He caught himself thinking about it while making coffee the next morning. He thought about it while repairing a neighbor's fence. Even while sitting quietly on his porch that evening, watching the sun disappear behind the trees, his mind returned to the same unanswered image. It wasn't simply curiosity. It was the feeling that the photograph had been carrying a story no one wanted to tell. The more David replayed his brief meeting with Thomas Reed, the more details refused to fit together. Thomas had arrived at the meeting unusually fast, almost as though he had been desperately searching for the wallet every minute it was missing. That part made sense. Anyone would want important identification returned quickly, but what happened afterward continued to trouble David. Thomas barely looked at the cash. He hardly glanced at the credit cards. Instead, the very first thing he searched for was the hidden compartment containing the faded photograph. The relief on his face appeared only after confirming the picture was still there. Then came the question David couldn't forget. Did you happen to look at the picture? It wasn't asked casually. It sounded cautious, almost fearful. And when David admitted he had seen it, Thomas's expression changed in a way that seemed impossible to fake. For a brief moment, it looked as though he regretted ever losing the wallet in the first place. Then he quickly recovered, forced a polite smile, and quietly ended the conversation, with words that echoed in David's thoughts long afterward. Some memories are better left alone. Most people might have accepted that explanation without another thought. David couldn't. Why would an ordinary photograph be hidden inside a secret pocket? Why carry it every single day instead of placing it safely inside an album at home? More importantly, who was the young girl standing beside that lonely wooden cabin? And why had someone written, "Don't forget what happened here," across the bottom, as though it were a promise instead of a caption? As the days passed, those questions became increasingly difficult to ignore. David considered calling Thomas simply to apologize for looking at something that was clearly personal, but another part of him sensed there was far more to the story than an old family memory. The photograph didn't look like it had been preserved because of sentimental value alone. It looked like evidence someone couldn't bear to lose. Every crease in the paper suggested years of being carried inside that wallet. Every faded mark hinted at countless moments when Thomas must have removed it, looked at it, and quietly placed it back where no one else would ever find it. David even wondered whether the cabin still existed somewhere or whether time had erased it long ago. Then, just as he considered putting the mystery behind him forever, the evening news interrupted his quiet routine with an image that instantly brought every unanswered question rushing back. There it was. The same weathered cabin, the same shape, the same front porch, the same surrounding trees, only now it stood abandoned, surrounded by construction crews preparing for demolition. David stared silently at the television, realizing this could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. He thought he had simply returned a lost wallet. He had no idea that one forgotten photograph had reopened a story buried for nearly 30 years. To understand why David Miller couldn't simply forget the photograph, we have to go back 2 days, before the evening news, before the unanswered questions, and before Thomas Reed's worn leather wallet unexpectedly crossed his path. David's life followed a rhythm that had changed very little over the years. Every morning began the same way. He woke before sunrise, brewed a pot of strong black coffee, and carried the first steaming mug onto the wooden porch overlooking the fields surrounding his small rural home. The quiet suited him. After decades of rushing toward emergencies as a firefighter, Silence had become something he deeply appreciated. Once the sun climbed above the trees, he usually spent part of the morning helping neighbors with repairs, fixing an old fence, replacing broken porch steps, or lending tools to anyone who needed them. In the afternoons, he worked a few hours at the local hardware store, where nearly everyone knew him by name. Weekends rarely changed. If the weather cooperated, David drove to the same lake he had visited with his late wife for years, casting a fishing line into calm water while remembering conversations that still felt as though they had happened yesterday. It wasn't an exciting life by most standards, but it was an honest one. David believed peace came from living simply, treating people fairly, and doing the right thing even when nobody was watching. Those values had carried him through loss, retirement, and every difficult chapter that followed. They also explained why returning Thomas Reed's wallet never felt like a decision at all. It simply reflected the kind of man David had spent his entire life trying to become. The reason honesty mattered so deeply to David reached back to one unforgettable afternoon many years earlier. His wife, Sarah, had accidentally lost her engagement ring while shopping at a busy grocery store shortly before their 20th wedding anniversary. They searched everywhere. Employees checked security footage, customers looked beneath shelves, and David even returned after closing time, hoping the ring might somehow appear. Hours passed without success, and Sarah quietly accepted that the ring, which carried more sentimental value than financial worth, was probably gone forever. 2 days later, someone knocked on their front door. Standing outside was a middle-aged man neither of them had ever met. He explained that he had found the ring in the parking lot, spent hours tracking down its owner, and simply wanted to return it. He refused every offer of money. He declined repeated invitations to stay for dinner. Before leaving, he smiled and said something David never forgot. "One day, you'll probably have the chance to do the same for someone else." Then he walked back to his truck and disappeared from their lives forever. David often thought about that stranger after Sarah passed away. The ring remained safely tucked inside a small wooden box, but the lesson attached to it stayed with him even more strongly. Since that day, if David found a wallet, a phone, a set of keys, or even a few dollars lying on the ground, he made every effort to return it. He never viewed honesty as extraordinary. He considered it repayment for a kindness his own family had once received. That was exactly why Thomas Reed's wallet initially seemed no different from anything else David had returned over the years. Yet from the moment he first held it in his hands, something felt unusually personal. The leather was worn smooth from decades of daily use, carefully repaired in several places instead of replaced with a newer wallet. Inside, everything appeared meticulously organized. Credit cards sat neatly behind transparent sleeves. Family photographs were noticeably absent, except for the faded picture hidden inside the secret compartment. Even before meeting Thomas, David sensed the wallet carried more emotional value than financial importance. When they finally met in the parking lot outside a neighborhood cafe, Thomas arrived almost 20 minutes earlier than expected, stepping quickly from his vehicle before David had even switched off the engine. His gratitude seemed genuine, but it was mixed with an urgency David couldn't quite understand. Thomas barely glanced at the cash or driver's license. Instead, his hands immediately searched the hidden compartment until his fingers touched the old photograph. Only then did he exhale quietly, as though he had been holding his breath since the wallet disappeared. David noticed something else as well, though it meant nothing to him at the time. While returning the photograph to its hidden place, Thomas's hands trembled slightly, not from age, but from emotion. It lasted only a second before he carefully closed the wallet again. David thought little of it during the drive home. It wasn't until everything else began unfolding that the memory returned with startling clarity. David noticed something during the handoff that didn't make sense until much later. The moment David Miller found the driver's license inside the wallet, he knew exactly what he intended to do. Years of experience had taught him that losing something personal could leave a person feeling anxious long before the financial consequences appeared. He searched for a phone number, through publicly available contact information, connected to the identification, and after several attempts, finally reached the owner. The man introduced himself as Thomas Reed. His voice was calm, polite, and deeply appreciative, but David noticed something unusual almost immediately. Before David could finish explaining where he had found the wallet, Thomas interrupted to ask whether it was still completely intact. David assured him that everything appeared untouched and that he would be happy to return it whenever convenient. Thomas didn't suggest meeting the following day or later that evening. Instead, he asked where David was standing at that very moment and said he could be there within 20 minutes. The urgency surprised David. Most people who recover a lost wallet are relieved, but Thomas sounded as though every passing minute mattered. They agreed to meet in the parking lot of a small neighborhood cafe located halfway between their homes. David arrived a few minutes early, expecting to wait. Instead, a dark sedan was already parked near the entrance. Thomas Reed stepped out almost immediately, as though he had been watching every vehicle that entered the lot. Thomas was a distinguished 62-year-old Black American man whose calm appearance reflected a lifetime spent guiding others. During their brief conversation, David learned he had recently retired after serving for many years as a respected school principal. His handshake was firm, his voice measured, and his gratitude appeared sincere, yet something about his behavior seemed strangely distracted. David handed him the worn leather wallet and expected the familiar routine that usually followed these encounters. Most people immediately counted their cash, checked their credit cards, or confirmed their driver's license remained inside. Thomas did none of those things. Without saying another word, he opened the wallet and moved directly toward the hidden compartment where the faded photograph had been tucked away. His fingers searched carefully until they touched the folded picture. The instant he saw it resting exactly where he had left it, an almost invisible wave of relief crossed his face. His shoulders, tense only moments earlier, slowly relaxed. It was the first genuine sign that he believed something important had truly been recovered. Only then did he glance briefly at the rest of the wallet's contents. David watched quietly, unable to understand why an old photograph seemed to matter far more than cash, identification, or every other valuable item inside. The moment lasted only a few seconds, but it stayed with David long after they parted ways. Just as David turned to leave, Thomas closed the wallet, looked toward him, and asked a question so unexpected that it stopped him in his tracks. "Did you happen to look at the picture?" The words were spoken gently, almost casually, yet there was something beneath them that David couldn't immediately identify. It wasn't anger, it wasn't accusation. It sounded more like concern. David considered pretending he hadn't noticed the photograph at all, but honesty had guided too many important moments in his life for him to abandon it now. After a brief pause, he quietly admitted that the photograph had slipped from the hidden pocket while he was identifying the wallet's owner, and that he had looked at it only long enough to notice the young girl, the old wooden cabin, and the handwritten words along the bottom. The effect was immediate. Thomas's expression changed in a way David would later replay countless times in his memory. The warmth disappeared from his eyes for just a moment before he carefully composed himself again. A faint smile returned to his face, though it seemed forced rather than natural. He lowered his gaze to the wallet resting in his hands and spoke almost as if he were reminding himself rather than David. "Some memories are better left alone." There was no anger in his voice, no threat, just quiet sadness, carried by someone who had lived with those memories for a very long time. Before David could ask what had happened at the cabin, or who the little girl was, Thomas thanked him once more, climbed back into his car, and slowly drove away without looking back. David stood beside his truck for several moments after Thomas disappeared down the highway. The entire conversation had lasted less than 10 minutes, yet something about it refused to settle comfortably in his mind. Every ordinary detail suddenly seemed worthy of another look. Why had Thomas searched for the photograph before checking anything else? Why had his hands trembled ever so slightly while returning it to the hidden compartment? Why had one simple question about a faded picture changed the entire atmosphere between two strangers? David eventually convinced himself that the photograph probably represented a painful family memory, and that Thomas simply wasn't ready to share it with anyone else. That explanation seemed reasonable enough. Life had taught David that everyone carries private burdens they rarely discuss. He climbed into his pickup, started the engine, and drove home believing the mystery belonged to Thomas alone. That should have been the end of the story. Instead, it was only the beginning. 3 days passed, and David Miller gradually convinced himself that Thomas Reed's mysterious photograph was simply one of those unanswered questions life occasionally leaves behind. Then, on a quiet Thursday evening, everything changed again. David was sitting in his living room watching the local news when a familiar image suddenly appeared on the television screen. A reporter stood beside an aging wooden cabin surrounded by construction equipment, explaining that the structure would soon be demolished after decades of sitting abandoned on county-owned land. David leaned forward almost instinctively. His heart began beating faster as he recognized every detail: the weathered front porch, the uneven roofline, the narrow dirt path leading toward the entrance. There was no doubt in his mind. It was the exact same cabin from the faded photograph hidden inside Thomas Reed's wallet. For a moment, David wondered if his memory was playing tricks on him, but the handwritten words beneath the picture immediately came rushing back. Don't forget what happened here. The timing felt impossible to ignore. Out of all the old buildings scattered throughout the region, why had this one suddenly appeared on the news only days after he discovered the photograph? Then the reporter mentioned something that transformed simple curiosity into genuine determination. Nearly 30 years earlier, the cabin had served as a temporary emergency shelter during one of the worst floods the county had ever experienced. Hundreds of families had been forced from their homes, volunteers had worked around the clock, and the cabin had become a refuge for people with nowhere else to go. David watched the report until it ended, but instead of feeling satisfied, he found himself overwhelmed by new questions. If the photograph came from those difficult days, why had Thomas hidden it away so carefully? And what exactly had happened there that someone wanted to remember forever? The following morning, David drove to the county library, where decades of local newspapers had been carefully preserved on digital archives and microfilm. He wasn't searching for anything specific at first. He simply wanted to understand why the cabin had carried such importance for Thomas Reed. Hours passed as David quietly worked his way through articles published during the weeks following the flood. He read about neighborhoods disappearing beneath rising water, rescue boats navigating streets that had become rivers, churches opening their doors to displaced families, and ordinary citizens risking their own safety to help complete strangers. Story after story described remarkable acts of courage performed by people who never expected recognition. Then, buried inside a feature article highlighting volunteers at the emergency shelter, David stopped turning the pages. Looking back at him from an old newspaper photograph was the same young girl he had seen inside Thomas's wallet. The resemblance was unmistakable. She stood outside the cabin, wrapped in a blanket, her expression serious despite the dozens of smiling volunteers surrounding her. David stared at the image for several moments before reading the accompanying article. It briefly identified the girl by her first name and described how she had been rescued during the height of the flooding after becoming separated from her family. According to the report, volunteers had worked tirelessly to reunite displaced children with their relatives while the shelter continued operating around the clock. Yet as David continued searching through later newspaper editions, something immediately struck him as unusual. The little girl's name appeared only once. After that single article, she seemed to vanish completely. There were no follow-up interviews, no family reunion stories, no public acknowledgments, and no further mention of what became of her after leaving the shelter. It was as though she had quietly disappeared from the historical record. David's curiosity quickly turned into careful investigation. He searched additional newspaper archives, historical society records, and publicly available community reports covering the months and years after the flood. Other children featured in similar rescue stories often appeared again later when communities celebrated rebuilding efforts or honored volunteers. Their names resurfaced during anniversary events and local memorials. But every attempt to trace the young girl from Thomas's photograph ended the same way. The record simply stopped. It wasn't proof that anything terrible had happened, but it left a silence that David couldn't explain. Then another detail emerged that changed the direction of his search entirely. While reviewing a newspaper article recognizing local volunteers, David noticed a familiar name listed among those who had worked at the emergency shelter throughout the disaster: Thomas Reed. Long before retiring as a respected school principal, Thomas had spent weeks volunteering at the cabin, helping families arriving with little more than the clothes they were wearing. Suddenly, the hidden photograph began making more sense. Thomas hadn't carried the picture because he happened to visit the cabin years ago. He had been there during one of the community's darkest moments. But if that explained why he treasured the photograph, it still failed to explain why he guarded it with such emotion, or why the little girl's story seemed to disappear almost immediately after the flood ended. David left the library believing he had uncovered evidence of a forgotten tragedy buried beneath decades of ordinary history. The truth was far more extraordinary. The questions David Miller carried home from the library refused to leave him alone. Every document he had read answered one mystery, only to create another. He now understood that the weathered cabin had once stood at the center of one of the county's worst natural disasters, and he knew Thomas Reed had been one of the volunteers who spent countless days helping frightened families rebuild their lives. Yet the faded photograph still made no sense. If it represented a moment of courage and compassion, why hide it inside a secret compartment where no one would ever see it? And why had Thomas reacted with such visible relief when he discovered it was still inside the wallet? After a long evening of reflection, David decided there was only one person who could answer those questions. He called Thomas the following morning, apologized for contacting him again, and explained that he had seen the cabin featured on the news. There was a long silence on the other end of the line before Thomas quietly agreed to meet one final time. They chose a quiet public park overlooking a small lake where very few people gathered during weekday afternoons. When David arrived, Thomas was already seated on a weathered wooden bench, the same worn leather wallet resting quietly in his hands. He looked toward David with a calm expression that carried none of the nervousness from their first meeting. It was almost as though he had spent the past few days deciding whether the time had finally come to tell someone the story he had protected for nearly 30 years. After several moments of quiet conversation, Thomas slowly removed the faded photograph from its hidden compartment and held it carefully between his fingers. He looked at the image for a long time before speaking. "She wasn't my daughter," he said softly, answering the question David had never spoken aloud. "Most people assume she was, but they always have." Thomas explained that nearly 3 decades earlier, relentless floodwaters had swept through entire neighborhoods with almost no warning. Hundreds of families lost homes, possessions, and every sense of security they once knew. Schools, churches, community centers, and even small cabins like the one in the photograph were transformed into temporary shelters where frightened strangers became neighbors overnight. Thomas had been a young teacher at the time, volunteering every free hour he could spare because he couldn't bear watching families face such overwhelming loss alone. The little girl in the photograph was one of dozens of children rescued during those desperate days. She had become separated from her relatives during the evacuation, and volunteers spent hours comforting her while emergency crews searched for her family. Thomas remembered how brave she tried to be, despite the fear in her eyes. The photograph had been taken only minutes after she arrived safely at the shelter. It wasn't meant for newspapers or recognition. It simply captured one quiet moment of hope in the middle of unimaginable hardship. Over the following days, countless volunteers risked their own safety crossing floodwaters, delivering supplies, rescuing trapped families, and carrying children to higher ground. Many of them returned to ordinary lives once the disaster ended, never receiving awards, interviews, or public acknowledgement. Their names slowly disappeared from memory, even though their actions had changed hundreds of lives forever. Thomas carefully turned the photograph over, gently running his thumb across the faded handwritten words at the bottom. "Don't forget what happened here." He smiled sadly before explaining that those 6 words were never intended as a clue or hidden message. They were a promise he had written to himself years after the flood ended. Every anniversary of the disaster, he worried that people remembered the destruction while slowly forgetting the extraordinary compassion that followed. News reports focused on damaged buildings, rising water, and financial losses. Very few people remembered the neighbors who gave away their own food, the volunteers who worked through exhaustion, or the strangers who opened their homes to families they had never met. Thomas feared those acts of courage would quietly disappear as new generations grew up without hearing the stories. So he carried the photograph every single day as a personal reminder that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary kindness when circumstances demand it. Every time he opened his wallet, he saw the faces of people who proved that humanity is often at its very best during its darkest moments. That was why the photograph mattered far more than the money surrounding it. It wasn't preserving evidence of a crime. It was preserving gratitude that time could never erase. David listened without interrupting, feeling the weight of Thomas's words settle quietly between them. Suddenly, every strange detail surrounding the wallet seemed to fit together. The hidden compartment, the careful way Thomas checked for the photograph before anything else, the sadness in his voice when he spoke about memories. It all came from a lifetime spent protecting something that couldn't be replaced. David realized the mystery had never been about the cabin itself. It had always been about the people whose courage filled that place during one unforgettable chapter in the community's history. Yet, just as David believed every unanswered question had finally found its explanation, Thomas looked down at the photograph one more time and sighed deeply. "There's one part of this story," he said quietly, "that I've never told anyone outside the people who were there." He folded the photograph carefully and returned it to its hidden place inside the wallet. Then he looked directly at David, with an expression that carried both gratitude and sorrow. "The reason I hid this picture all these years has nothing to do with the flood." David felt his heartbeat quicken once again. He thought he had finally reached the end of the mystery. Instead, he was about to learn why Thomas had hidden the photograph for so many years. Thomas Reed remained silent for several moments, watching the gentle ripples move across the lake before finally speaking again. People have asked me about that photograph before, he said quietly. Some thought it was my daughter. Others believed it captured a family tragedy. A few even imagined it was connected to something the police had never solved. I always let them believe whatever they wanted, because the truth was much simpler, and at the same time, far more important. Thomas explained that after the flood, local newspapers briefly recognized a handful of volunteers who had coordinated rescue efforts. His own name appeared in several articles because he happened to be one of the people willing to speak with reporters. But the men and women who climbed into dangerous floodwaters, carried frightened children through chest-deep currents, cooked meals around the clock, donated clothing, opened their homes to complete strangers, and quietly returned to ordinary life after everything was over, rarely appeared in front of a camera. They were the people Thomas believed deserved to be remembered. Every anniversary ceremony gradually became smaller, until eventually they stopped altogether. Buildings were repaired, roads reopened, families rebuilt their lives. Time moved forward, as it always does. Yet Thomas refused to let those ordinary heroes disappear with it. That was why the photograph never left his wallet. He never displayed it on his office wall, never framed it inside his home, and never posted it where others could admire it. He feared that if people learned he carried the picture, the conversation would eventually become about Thomas Reed, instead of the hundreds of ordinary neighbors whose courage had transformed one desperate community. The photograph wasn't hidden because it contained a dangerous secret. It was hidden because Thomas wanted the people inside the memory, not himself, to remain at the center of the story. David Miller lowered his eyes toward the worn leather wallet resting quietly between them, and finally understood why the mystery had followed him ever since the afternoon he found it. For days he had convinced himself the faded photograph might reveal a forgotten crime, an unsolved disappearance, or some painful family history buried beneath decades of silence. Instead, what he discovered was something the modern world often overlooks. Gratitude doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it lives quietly inside an old wallet, folded carefully into a hidden compartment, waiting only to remind one person that extraordinary kindness should never be forgotten. David realized that Thomas hadn't spent nearly 30 years protecting evidence. He had spent 30 years protecting a legacy. Every crease in that photograph represented another year he refused to allow those volunteers to vanish from memory. Every time he opened his wallet to pay for groceries or buy a cup of coffee, he quietly honored people whose names history would probably never record. It suddenly made perfect sense why Thomas searched for the photograph before checking his money. Cash can be replaced. Credit cards can be canceled. Identification can be reissued. But memories disappear forever the moment nobody chooses to carry them anymore. In that quiet realization, David understood that the most valuable thing inside Thomas Reed's wallet had never been the money. It had always been the promise written beneath that faded picture. Don't forget what happened here. As David stood to leave, he shook Thomas's hand one final time, grateful that a simple act of honesty had unexpectedly connected him to a story he would carry for the rest of his life. Sometimes we spend years searching for mysteries hidden in forgotten places, convinced that every unanswered question must lead to something shocking. Yet every so often, the greatest discoveries are the ones that remind us how powerful ordinary people can be. A lost wallet became a lesson about integrity. A faded photograph became a tribute to courage. And one simple decision to return something that didn't belong to him gave David a memory he would never lose. Perhaps that's why stories like this continue to resonate long after they end. They remind us that history isn't remembered only through monuments or headlines. Often, it's preserved by quiet people who refuse to let acts of compassion disappear. Before we finish, we'd love to hear your thoughts. If you had opened that wallet, would you have looked at the hidden photograph? Do you think Thomas should have shared this remarkable story years ago? Or was he right to protect the memory in silence? And what's one memory from your own life that you'll never allow yourself to forget? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because your story may inspire someone else. If stories like this remind you that ordinary people often carry extraordinary memories, subscribe for more unforgettable true story-inspired mysteries. And if you thought this story stayed with you, wait until you hear what happens in our next documentary, because sometimes the smallest discovery changes the way we see an entire lifetime.